Welcome to another edition of the Mediatwits. I'm Mark Glaser, Executive Editor of PBS MediaShift, coming to you from San Francisco. This week we're going to be talking about a story in Grantland, an ESPN publication about a golf club inventor who was outed as being transgender, and the repercussions of that article, both in a Twitter storm and also in a suicide of the inventor. We'll talk about the ethics behind posting that story, the corrections, and the aftermath of that story, and also the issues of transgender people and how they're covered in the media, and what the ethics is around digging deeper into their identity and what they've done in the past. Before we get into discussing the story, I want to introduce our roundtable for the Mediatwits this week. We have Andrew Lee from American University joining us. We have Claire Groden, our Mediatwits intern. We have Kelly McBride from Poynter Institute. We have Tom Scocca from Gawker. And we've all been kind of following this story over the past week and the way it's unfolded. Bill Simmons, who runs Grantland, said that within the first 56 hours of the story coming out, there was just all kinds of lauds and all kinds of people saying how great the story was and how interesting it was, as Caleb Hannan, the reporter, had dug for, I believe, 8 months into this story to find out about this mysterious golf club inventor, found out that she had falsified a lot of the information about her kind of degrees and where she studied, but also the reporter said he had a chill down his spine when he found out that she had actually been born a boy and was transgender. That stoked a huge Twitter storm and a backlash to the story, prompting corrections and really a lot of soul searching among the people at Grantland and at ESPN. We asked ESPN, Caleb Hannan, and Bill Simmons to join us, and they weren't able to. But we can tell that there's been a lot of thought and a lot of kind of backlash on this. Kelly, I'm curious, as someone who is looked at ethics for so long, did you see this as kind of a long line of people with just not being very sensitive to transgender issues? How did you see this story? What did you think were some of its strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, and let me point out that I was the ombudsman, the lead writer for the Poynter Ombudsman Project for 18 months. And so I have not necessarily inside knowledge, but I've been in this position before of looking at something that happened at ESPN and trying to figure out why it happened. Bill Simmons in his apology wrote that more than 12 people had looked at the story and that they had been in contact with Caleb as he was reporting the story out. And what he says in his apology is that it wasn't the right 12 people, that they didn't have enough diversity of opinion, that they didn't have anyone in that process who really understood transgendered issues. And it wasn't like they were on deadline trying to do this. They had lots and lots of time. There was no urgency for running the story when it ran, and there was certainly no urgency for Caleb Hannan when he was reporting the story to reveal to one of the company's investors that Dr. V was transgender, to essentially out her, not in publication, which he ultimately did, but to one of his sources. So the process broke down, and the process broke down because they didn't have the right people in the process, and that's common at ESPN to not. I mean, it's a mostly male organization. They tend to be narrowly focused on sports. They've had similar problems when the Penn State sexual abuse case came up. They have to remind themselves constantly that just because you have 12 people doesn't mean you have diversity of thought or diversity of experience. That when you're working at a narrow organization, a narrowly focused organization, you're most likely going to have to work to get the kind of diversity you need to make a healthy ethical decision.
And Tom, you wrote a really interesting story for Gawker, kind of going over what you saw as some of the failings of the story, and you thought one of the biggest problems was that the writer never really followed up on whether this club really was useful or really what kind of breakthrough it was making.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the striking things about Simmons' apology was that he said that the story hadn't been ready to run in its earlier form, which was an earlier form that included the discovery that the golf club inventor was transgender, but didn't include the suicide. And it was only after the suicide that the writer went back and wrote a new draft that was that they thought worked. And I think that what the piece showed, if you read through it, was that they actually hadn't, before you get to this sort of terrible business of suicide, they hadn't really nailed down the reporting on the rest of the feature. It was the story of a golf club that was supposed to be revolutionary, but he hadn't actually ever figured out whether it was revolutionary or not. It was the story of this troubled inventor with a backstory that didn't hold up under scrutiny, but his relations with her as a source broke down, and she stopped talking to him, and he just sort of left it there, even after an offer to for them to come in and talk under off-the-record conditions. Rather than taking that as sort of a starting point to negotiate some kind of access where you could learn something more about their side of things. It seems like that just got left there, and then they just had the story sitting there and weren't going to do anything with it. And then it was the suicide that gave them something that they thought merited running the story.
Did you think that they should have run the story at all, Tom, or do you think they should have just rethought running it in general, or do you think it should have just been, he should have dug a little deeper, it should have been a different story?
That's a really tough counterfactual, because so many things seem to go out of control in the reporting process, where as an editor, if you're sort of counterfactually looking at this and wondering what would happen to be in a situation, one of your hopes would have been that you would have gotten a hand in the reporting process sooner and encouraged some different tactics and different priorities in the reporting. A lot of editors I know have been asking themselves that if they'd had a freelance, it's not like we don't these days all tend to have freelancers who are off doing projects that we are closely supervising. That's the question. Is there something that got to this point? What would we have done about the story? On the one hand, just to do a story at all, it seems like it would feel exploitative. On the other hand, if somebody's suicide is tied to the reporting that you've been doing, it's sort of bizarre to leave it untouched. And I think that the decision to have done the story is not wrong, but I think that they needed to blow the story up and rethink the whole thing much more than they did. I think they needed to do more reporting. There were appeals made to Simmons's note. The unknowability of suicide and how there's no one who can tell her side of the story, but in fact her business partner and her girlfriend, that's one person, survived her and presumably has something to say, although now she's lawyered up. So I think that there was some very painful reporting and difficult reporting that could have been done to make the story different. But I think what you saw in the piece was actually sort of the remnant pieces of a couple different versions of the story, which hadn't even been particularly effectively integrated.
And Andrew, what was your take on the way this story played out? I know you kind of had similar instances when you were writing about your Wikipedia book. You had something that came up that was similar. What was your take on what happened at Grantland?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Kelly said was right. You want not just 12 people and thinking that the law of large numbers is going to help balance out a story. You need the right 12 folks. But there's two really interesting anecdotes from the Wikipedia experience I thought was interesting for this. One of the biggest controversies and crises in Wikipedia's history was this past year with the case of Chelsea/Bradley Manning. And in fact, one of the strange parts about the Wikipedia experience with trying to write about transgendered individuals was that in the first 24 hours after Bradley Manning said he wanted to be known as Chelsea Manning, Wikipedia flipped that article right away. Wikipedia being pretty progressive in being sensitive to LGBT issues and having a big user community from lots of different viewpoints. So they did the right thing. They got some praise from lots of blogs. I think Slate even wrote something that said Wikipedia's got it right, while AP and other folks were slow to change their pronouns. But then what happened was about 24 hours after that decision, the Wikipedia, I don't want to say the community, but a large cohort of Wikipedians got that article changed back to Bradley Manning for a month, saying that he was born a man, there's no legal change of his status, therefore we need to go back to the male pronoun and Bradley Manning. And it was a huge uproar in the community, and they couldn't even get it right with hundreds and hundreds of people who come from lots of different backgrounds. So even if you had more than 12, and even if you had lots of folks debating this, it wasn't clear Wikipedia came up with the right answer either. This is kind of hard stuff to figure out, considering transgendered issues are fairly new to the news industry in terms of writing across lots of different, I guess, news outlets. The other thing that was interesting related to this from my book reporting was one of the main characters I cultivated over the years for writing about Wikipedia was an underage gay teenage boy who was a very prolific editor but very controversial in the Wikipedia community. And over the year that I was reporting on him, he had confided in me that he was getting anxiety attacks and that he was losing sleep and that he was suffering because of a lot of these things that were happening on Wikipedia. And I was very fearful that if I really wrote everything that I really want to write about him, that I would really affect his life in negative ways. He was, kept at home, away from school because of some of the issues he was dealing with. So in the end, I decided to just axe him completely from the book, except for a little mention, because I was afraid of the impact writing about him would have. Now, I had a much easier situation because I had about 20 or 30 other people I could turn to and still complete my book on Wikipedia. In this case, as Tom was talking about, whether you kill the entire article or not is a really tough call if you've been working 8 months on it. And I think this is one of the problems of journalists sometimes, that we're so close to the story, we're used to acting like a pit bull and attacking and grabbing and holding with our jaws, that we sometimes don't get good perspective on these stories. And if they were really to step back from it and look at the entirety of the story, Tom did a good job of saying that there are kind of 3 semi-completed stories in this one story. It really didn't hold together completely. And if you had some more perspective on this, if you kind of recognized your fault lines and the deficiencies of how you're reporting this, maybe that decision could have gone better for the ESPN crew there.
And Sid Ziller, who is the co-founder of Outsports.com, wrote a story on Huffington Post saying that, transgender people, 41% attempt to commit suicide, which is 25 times the regular population. And there should be more sensitivity. He says that he has certain rules that he follows when it comes to covering trans people, that you should always use the personal pronoun of their current, what their gender is now is her. You should not talk about their past gender unless you have express consent from the person you're writing about. Kelly, is that a rule that you think is fair? Is that something everyone should follow? Should Caleb have not written about the transgender identity of Dr. V?
So I get really uncomfortable when we talk about these absolutes. I think that there has to be a really high threshold and a really healthy process for making these decisions. But and I think that in general we should defer to individuals in the pronouns that they would like to use and the identities that they prefer to express. I can think of a number of scenarios where I think it would be justified in clearing that threshold and going either against an individual's wishes or outing someone essentially against what I think most of the GLBT community would agree would be reasonable. But I think that those cases are rare. I think they're very rare. And listening to Tom, it was just that we can't separate ethics from the reporting and editing process, and that's when we try and write these absolute rules or categorical imperatives. That's what we're doing. We're saying, okay, we're going to do the reporting over here, and then over here we're going to have our ethics, and we're just going to lay it over the top, and maybe we'll change some things because of it. When really, this is an editorial problem. This is the vision of the story has to be crafted in a way that it is justified, that you can take the reader on a journey and you can show them something. And in this particular story, I think Grantland tried to do that. And in this particular story, the device they used was the personal narrative of the writer, Caleb, in his journey to improve his short game in golf. But it just didn't hold together, and it didn't justify the decisions that they made. The story didn't justify the decisions. And so as journalists, our process for reporting has to be imbued with our values and our ethical standards, and we really have to figure out what the story is about. And then as we figure that out, we will address the ethical issues as they come up. And that's why it's so hard to go back and to say, oh, well, what should they have done? Well, you know, they should have had a better story in the first place, and then it would be easier to make these choices, or at least easier to justify and articulate them. But since they didn't, I mean, it's really hard to go back and say, oh, here's the story they should have told, because we weren't in that position. We can't do the reporting for them. You know, but when it comes to those rules, I think that's what we want in journalism. We want this industrial model where we can say, okay, you know, if A, then B, and we want a decision tree. And it's way too complicated, and this issue in particular is super, super complicated. And so it really relies on a healthy process.
And Tom, I'm curious, what do you think about people who have said that, you know, leaving out the transgender of Dr. V would leave the story kind of incomplete? I think Bill Simmons might have mentioned that too, and some others have said that, you know, if that wasn't mentioned, it would have come out in some other way, and then the story would have looked like it was incomplete or not done all the way. Do you believe that, or do you think there was a different way to handle it?
I think that it's not necessarily true. Not that it's necessarily untrue either. I think that a bunch of the people who've been doing close readings of this piece have flagged the same thing, which is that actually there's a different pivot of the piece. He set up his pivot of discovery around the moment when someone led him up to the brink of explaining that she was transgender. But before he got to that point, the whole reason that he was talking to this person was that this person worked for a city that she sued, and she sued the city while she was employed by the city as an automotive mechanic supervisor, I think, or something. Which is to say, and there's a point in the story where her partner, in an immediate exchange with the reporter, says, "Oh, you're trying to say that this putter designed by a world-class physicist was really designed by a lesbian auto mechanic?" That's like, well, setting aside her lesbian status, even, yes, like the fact that this person who claimed to be a PhD in aerospace with experience working on top secret defense projects, including the stealth bomber, was actually a municipal auto mechanic. That is a revelation that can build a story of repertorial discovery around. And then the issue with her transgender status had more to do with the fact that when he had gone looking for her credentials, he couldn't find them, and in fact, she didn't seem to exist before 2000 or 2003 or something. So it was unquestionably germane to his process of reporting it, but the contradiction that the story really pivoted on was something that didn't directly involve her transgender status. And I think the thing to have done with it was for him to have taken that fact to her. You know, like I said, there's a whole business about how she and her partner had offered to talk to him with everything bound by a non-disclosure agreement, and he said as a reporter he couldn't do that, which is not unreasonable as a starting point for both sides, but that's where you come back to that, because you're in possession of a fact. She was, at the time, she was supposed to be a PhD scientist working on the stealth bomber. She was a municipal auto mechanic. That fact is known, that fact is publishable, and she can tell you she wants to go off the record. But that fact is not under her control to put it on her record. And so with that, you're in a much better position to talk to her about what her side of the story is, what she's willing to go on the record about, how she can explain. That's great. She was still claiming that she had educational credentials that he just had failed to turn up, which I don't think anyone knows whether it was true or not, since it was so hard to test. So there was a whole bunch of reporting that could have happened that didn't. and if he'd recognized that her credentials and her employment as a mechanic were a hard fact on which the story could turn, then that would have been a much better context for dealing with the whole question of whether her transgender status was ultimately going to be germane to the story or not.
I'm curious, Andrew, what do you think about, the way this kind of Twitter storm plays out where, Grantland didn't really have comments on the story, and, it was hard for them to get immediate feedback. Bill Simmons said there was 56 hours before there was feedback. What role do these kind of, we've seen these Twitter storms before around things that come out, people get really upset about it. Usually there's not really a search for truth as much as there is a tendency to kind of petition, boycott, etc. How did you see this kind of playing out over social media, and was there some value, more value to it than usual in this kind of Twitter storm?
Yeah, some other folks had pointed out the fact that Grantland doesn't have comments enabled for their articles, so that kind of put a little damper on any kind of immediate feedback at where the article was. So that was certainly part of the dynamic there. Of course, if you're trying to just use Twitter to understand, what the general feedback is, that's kind of like using the second hand of a clock to tell what time it is. It's really hard to figure out whether this is authentic, whether it's artificial, whether there has been canvassing of people to complain to Grantland. So it was tough for them to kind of put their finger on the pulse of really what was going on out there. I think it is something that they're probably going to reconsider how they solicit feedback better from the audience, because I think certainly having that's very unusual to have that big gap in terms of publishing time to really understanding what your audience thinks about the piece.
Yeah, and you see things that are so extreme on either side that the writer basically killed her, and things just kind of spiral out of control, and it's really hard to get a handle on what the opinion is because there always is so many extremes.
Right.
Kelly, how did you see that kind of playing out with the reaction and how Grantland reacted to it? I mean, Grantland is kind of one of these personal brand medias we've been talking a lot about, with Bill Simmons kind of creating his own media, little mini media empire within ESPN. I mean, what does it say about these kinds of journalistic outfits, starting from kind of a blog and becoming a little media empire?
Well, I think what you have there is you have the story that Caleb wrote was about a guy trying to improve his golf game and thinking he'd found the solution and actually seeing improvements in his golf game. And then when he discovered that the person behind the solution was a fraud, his golf game fell apart. And that is a great story for the Grantland audience. I mean, that's like that worked really well for them. And so I think when Bill says that, like, for 56 hours they had really good feedback, that was within their audience. They probably did have really good feedback, and you saw it tweeted out a lot with complimentary things because it resonated within that audience. When it got to a larger audience, which everything does these days, right? Everything goes from its intended audience to a larger audience. That's when the criticisms came in. And of course, maybe Grantland isn't or the staff from Grantland isn't necessarily in touch with that larger audience because they're not, for whatever reasons. And so so then the larger audience was having a conversation with itself, and that conversation was happening on Twitter or in other venues. Jezebel flagged it, which is obviously a very different audience than Grantland, and they had a very different conversation at Jezebel than they had within the Grantland audience. I think this is really similar. Remember when the New Yorker had the radicalized cartoon of the Obamas on the cover, and people went crazy, and they said, oh, this doesn't, this is offensive. Well, that cartoon made sense to the New Yorker audience. But then beyond the New Yorker audience, people read all sorts of things into it because they didn't have a relationship with the New Yorker. And we as publishers, we always have to take that into account. Bill created Grantland very specifically to sort of throw off the constraints of what a sports columnist has to deal with and tell these these stories that were very long and intended for a very specific audience, and so you may consider this phenomenon where once the story gets beyond this particular audience, it's misunderstood or it faces criticisms that the original audience wouldn't necessarily level. You may consider that collateral damage, but I think considering the weight of this story, and I would never say that Caleb caused Dr. V to commit suicide. I mean, suicide's a complicated phenomenon, but considering the fact that someone committed suicide in the telling of this story, that's what sort of that should have been the flag that told them that this would go beyond their audience and that they needed to pay attention to it. If they were going to tell this story, they needed to figure out a way to tell it that would resonate with other audiences as well and would justify the editorial decisions that they were making. So,
do you think that there's some good that can come out of this story, and that now maybe there will be more sensitivity at Grantland and its sports publications around these issues, and that more people will think about kind of trans issues and the way they should approach these subjects in the future?
Oh, sure, sure. I mean, every time something like this happens, we get smarter as a community of journalists. Now, sometimes we forget along the way. It's not necessarily a steady upward progression. So we get smarter. Other people who are watching learn that, like, oh, you know, it's actually not that hard to find a trans person and bring them into a conversation if you need to. ESPN, it turned out, had someone in ESPN's entire universe, a baseball writer, that they've designated as the person that you're supposed to bring into that conversation.
Christina Kahrl, right?
Right, and Grantland operates as like its own little satellite, right? It's not necessarily completely enmeshed with the rest of ESPN. It's out in Los Angeles, and she was not brought into that conversation. So, I mean, ESPN already knew what they were supposed to do. And so, yeah, of course we learned some things along the way. They're hard lessons to learn, though.
Andrew, did you have any last thoughts about, you know, what we get out of this story and where we can go moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kelly answered a lot of the issues in a really great way. I mean, one of the things that came up at the end of this whole episode is you got some opinions from the transgender community saying, you know, reporters should never probe into this part of their life. This is, you know, either their deep cover that shouldn't be violated unless they allow you to. But there are times where you cannot just designate a no-fly zone where you never enter, right, for sources. And I think Kelly did a great job of saying that threshold has to be very high, right? You do have to respect that privacy. But even for folks who are not transgendered, we as journalists sometimes have to pierce that circle of privacy if it's in the interest of the reader or the interest of the public. And that's something that I think, as Kelly rightly said, there's no absolutes in this case saying that we cannot enter that specific area and domain. And, you know, as advice for folks who are dealing with this in the future, you know, certainly one of the most valuable things that journalists can get as training is through folks like the Maynard Institute, where you have frameworks to understand or ways to recognize things you don't know, right? The hardest thing is to understand things you don't understand. And even though I've been actively involved with Unity, journalists of color, and Asian American journalists, and Hispanic journalists, and Black journalists, I often find myself, you know, looking at something saying, I don't really know what the right thing to do is, but I'll turn to someone at these journalist organizations and say, hey, should I be using Chicano here, Hispanic, Latino? Should I be doing here? I think I'm doing something wrong. So I think that's the most important thing, is to know that there are folks out there that you can confide in that are looking out to make sure peers are doing a good job, and you can turn to these folks for advice. And I think, you know, folks like Poynter are part of the solution as well in finding those resources to help you do your job.
And Tom, I'm curious, do you think that Gawker would also kind of look at this a little bit differently? Is there a different standard as far as whether they might out someone or talk about kind of a transgender person's past?
Well, I mean, it's certainly true you've had people throwing out blanket rules, using this case as an opportunity to say that outing is always wrong in all cases, and everyone knows that, and you know, Gawker outs people when circumstances warrant. usually it's I don't know that we've done any transgender outing. I think it's mostly closeted gay people in public roles, but it's Gawker's definitely not a place that's going to embrace any blanket prohibition on reporting anything along those lines. So the idea that that everyone is now subscribed to a new set of absolutes is, I think, wishful on the part of the people who are putting it forward. I think that on the specific issue of how trans people are treated in the media, I think that just the fact that probably the number of people who've read the GLAAD style guide has gone up by an order of magnitude over the past week is going to just sort of change the baseline ways that people are written about it. If not the underlying ethical decisions about the serious reporting cases. I think that also this is aside from the trans issues, particularly, I think that an editor friend of mine called this long form Altamont. I think this is a moment when the sort of cult of the quality journalism, which is what the Grantland brand is largely built around, the idea that the story comes above all, and that the stories that have light and death elements are higher quality and more artistic. I think that infected both the process of reporting the story and the initial enthusiastic reception among the Grantland crowd. I think that a lot of the cult of sort of writering, of important long form, is it's the people who are into that are skewed toward white guys, off of sort of limited experience in the world, and it's a sort of self-reinforcing culture that I think got a serious warning that its values and priorities are not in the perfect place, and that it's not incorporating as many perspectives as it ought to. And so, in that people might think a little bit harder about whether the story comes first, and ask themselves harder questions about whether the story is good enough. I hope that results from this.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks a lot. I really appreciate you all joining us and talking about it. It's a complicated and difficult subject, and one that comes up a lot, just as far as ethics goes and what to post, when to post, and kind of the culture of long-form journalism. So I want to thank our panel: Andrew Lee from American University, Claire Grodin, Mediatwits intern, Kelly McBride from Poynter, Tom Scocca from Gawker. And we'll catch you every week with Mediatwits podcast every Friday morning at MediaShift at pbs.org/MediaShift. We'll catch you next week. Thanks a lot, everyone.